Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. This week's video is on a game series that I haven't really covered, and in all honesty, I don't think this video will perform all that well. I don't know if it'll really align with my audience. It's something that interests me, so I'm gonna throw it out there. We're gonna be talking about Far Cry. More specifically, we're gonna be talking about some leaks related to the upcoming entry, Far Cry 7. But before we begin, we're gonna discuss some of the previous entries in the series, the perceived decline of the franchise, and why these leaks for Far Cry 7 actually look really encouraging for the series. So without further ado, let's begin. Now, I want to talk about my experience with Far Cry. I grew up knowing friends who loved Far Cry when I was in, elementary school, 10 or 11. My neighbor, all he talked about was Far Cry 3 and 4, I believe. I think he mostly played 4. That was my first ever experience with the game, but I didn't really grow up with an Xbox One, and I had an Xbox 360, but all I played on it was Fallout New Vegas and Skyrim. Actually, about, I want to say 6 months ago or so, my best friend was like, hey, we should play Far Cry 5, and I had no idea that the games were actually co-op. So we played through the entirety of Far Cry 5, and we had an absolute blast. And we've currently started Far Cry New Dawn. Now, of course, any game can be fun with friends, and I'll be the first one to admit, I absolutely have a little bit of a bias towards Far Cry 5, because obviously it's the first one I really sat down and played. I played it with my best friend, and, you know, when you play a game with friends, it can make any game fun, no matter how bad it is. That's not to say it's bad, but I think there's a larger conversation about Far Cry 5 and the fan receptions and the reception of the series as a whole that we need to talk about. While Far Cry 5 was a financial hit and the critics were like, it's good, fans thought of it as a perfect example of a decline within the series. Now, this idea of Far Cry declining in quality kind of started when Far Cry 4 came out. Many fans pointed back to Far Cry 2 and how it handled not only the world, but the atmosphere, the story, the tone, that kind of thing. 2 was dark, and it was immersive. When I talk about the immersion, I'm of course referring to the injury system, as well as the map and the way that those are implemented within the game. You also had a time limit, so time was of the essence. Everything was important. It was taken a lot more seriously, and a lot of effort was put into that to make it feel immersive. Then Far Cry 3. Far Cry 3 stripped away some of the gameplay elements that made it so immersive. It also stripped away the time limit, and it isn't as serious at points, but the writing is so clear, the vision of what the writers wanted for the game is very clear, and people love it for its story and for its amazing performances. So people didn't really see it as a bad thing that they took those things out, because so much went into the other aspects of it that it became a phenomenon. But you can see how even early on things were beginning to shift. 4 was considered a real misstep, a real step in the wrong direction. Not many people were fans of it, as far as I remember and the research I've done. Many point to that as sort of the beginning of the end, at least around the time of Far Cry 5. If you asked a fan around Far Cry 5 what they thought of 4, they would be like, oh, that's where it all went wrong, and then 5 is also not as good. So then when 5 came out with its absurd humor, over-the-top jokes, and being set in the United States, many fans were disappointed with it. Many of the hardcore fans were disappointed in 5. The general public enjoyed it because it was silly, it was a fun action game, and you could play it with your friends. But like I said, to those hardcore Far Cry fans, it was not good. Also, Far Cry 5 removed crafting, also didn't include a voiced protagonist for, I think, the first time in the series. Even Far Cry Primal had a character who spoke occasionally. So this also took away from the story because you were very passive in it. Whereas in Far Cry 3, your character has very clear motivations. Far Cry 6 was seen as sort of a return to form. It also came out to a resounding meh, it was fine. I think they wanted to try to recapture the other Far Cry's magic, but try to set it in almost an urban environment at points, but not really. However, I think recently a lot of people have sort of changed their opinion on Far Cry 5. When doing research on this video, I found many posts ranking Far Cry 5 fairly high up. For a lot of people, even their second or third favorite game in the series. I even found one post that jokingly asked, so when did we change our mind about Far Cry 5? And I think that's because at its core, despite its problems and despite all the jokes that definitely garnered a lot of attention when the game first came out, there is a well-crafted narrative at the bottom of this with very interesting antagonists and a very interesting part of the world that we hadn't seen in Far Cry before. And I think that's why people are coming back around and appreciating it. They're not putting the expectations that they had from Far Cry 2, Far Cry 3 onto it. Instead, they're seeing, hey, Far Cry 5's on sale. Let me buy that, try it for the first time, and they just enjoy it for what it is. But all of that brings us to Far Cry 7 and some recent leaks. This user on Reddit seems to be a fairly reliable source for leaks within Far Cry. The post goes, "Last year I posted some casting calls for Far Cry 7, which have since been taken down. So here's a summary of what we can gather from the character descriptions. The plot seems to revolve around a wealthy family called the Bennetts: Layla, Dax, Bree, Christian, Henry, and Krista. The family members engage in a power struggle similar to the series Succession. One of the villains, named Ian Duncan, is described as a conspiracy theorist with an army of believers, and an envy of the wealthy elite and the power they wield. Alongside these characters are two others who appear to be secondary, John McKay and a doctor named Safan Kazan. Another detail is that New England is mentioned several times in the description, suggesting this could be the setting." This next leak is from Insider Gaming. They were referring to a couple of code-named projects within Ubisoft that had some information coming out about them. Blackbird is the one that we will be focusing on. The article said, "On the flip side, Blackbird will now see the player have to rescue his family, who have been kidnapped by a conspiracy cult who have been performing hallucinogenic experiments on animals and children. It said that the player has 24 real-life hours, 72 hours in-game, to rescue their family, and the timer is reflected in-game by the player wearing a watch on his wrist. Other aspects, including the inventory system and looting, also appear to bleed from the extraction-based shooter into Blackbird 2, with sources outlining that it doesn't affect the mainline entry. Quote, I'd argue it makes a lot of sense given your desperation to rescue your family, one source said when asked. On top of that, there was a rumor that your actions would have a lot more of a consequence of who survived within the family and things like that. So there would be a little more player agency. And to quickly clarify about this extraction shooter that's mentioned, all they're saying is that they are developing an extraction shooter. They're simply using the same kind of loot interface for this new Far Cry game. And I think this news is absolutely huge. Not only are we coming back to the United States, but we've got another cult on our hands. I think the goal with Far Cry 7, according to these leaks at least, is that they're hoping to take on that criticism of the game's gameplay declining over time, the story's not being serious enough. I think they're trying to take that and attack it head on. Now we have the reintroduction of the timer, similar to Far Cry 2, which puts much higher stakes on the character. They also mention movement changes being made. This could mean overhauling gameplay and gunplay so it doesn't feel stale anymore. This would, once again, help to refresh the series and take on those criticisms. I imagine the main character will be voiced again, and you'll be a member of this family. We don't know which member that was mentioned is the main character, but because of the mention of Succession and all the infighting within the family, I imagine they'll need a voiced protagonist because your character is going to be gunning for the wealth and gunning for control of the family as well. You are just the lucky one who wasn't kidnapped or was able to escape. I also think the mention of possibly setting it in New England is really interesting. New England has a lot of dark history. Whether it's the early colonization days or the fact that so many authors like Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft set their work in Maine, which is in the New England area, I'm also very curious how urban the game will be. How much of this is going to be set in a major town or city, because I don't really think of thick, deep woods and mountains when I think of the New England area. Now, maybe I'm mistaken. I've only really driven through the area and spent some time in Maine. But it will be interesting to see how they balance out the terrain, because you do have oceans, you do have forests, so I'm curious how they balance everything out. I think there's a lot to take from in terms of the darker atmosphere. I would also, this is a side note, but I would also love to see from one of the DLCs, they would have something horror related because it's set the New England area. Maybe something directly related to Stephen King, H.P. Lovecraft, that kind of thing. Yeah, I know it's silly, and I know that's like You know, the DLCs are always kind of silly or different, so I think that would be a fun way to take advantage of the area that you have. But anyway. And finally, with the story, while we don't know the beats exactly, assuming that your character is a member of the family, they are voiced, and we know that actions will have consequences, it makes me wonder what kind of choices you'll have to make and how that cause and effect will work. I think the best way that they could use that is with this struggle for power within the family. Maybe there's a sibling or someone that you like more than others and you choose to go save them first, or you choose to do something, a side quest that allows you to give them more control or take it for yourself. I think it'll really come down to how selfish does the player want to be when it comes to this family, and where is that line between, you know, doing anything for your family and fighting for yourself. So all of that to say, it tells me that Ubisoft is fully aware of the reputation that Far Cry has gained over the years, of how the stories aren't really dark or interesting anymore, how the gameplay has become stale, and they're trying to tackle that head on, and I have to commend them for that. I'm really excited for what could possibly be next in the series, especially with the return of the cult. I think they did a fantastic job. As one note, as some aspects of the cult in Far Cry 5 could be, I found them very, very interesting, and especially with how they're expanded upon in Far Cry New Dawn. I'm very interested to see what they do with this other cult in the New England area. I imagine they'll be more of a rebellious kind of group, not necessarily religious, but they mention conspiracy theories around the founder, so maybe this is someone who wants to take on the elite, but he's not doing it the right way. Maybe he himself was once an elite and fell from grace and built himself back up with this group, or things like that. There's so many interesting ideas you could go with this group and with this location. So tell me what you guys think. Do you think Far Cry 7 will change the course of the series, kind of revive it, bring a lot of energy and force back to the series, or do you think I'm over-exaggerating? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate every single one of you, and I hope you have a good morning or evening or, you know, whatever.